أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Brothers, sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are in our second installment in a two-part series to discuss the peace treaty of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. As we said the last time we met, the life of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, particularly more than perhaps other chapters in Islamic history or the lives of Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam, is filled with fabrications and distortions, and the manner in which we presented it was layers upon layers of distortions with motives, some of which we saw, for instance, as a first layer coming to us from Bani Umayyah, the Umayyads, who had their own reasons for distorting the image and the motives and the character of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. And then a few generations later, you have Bani Al Abbas, who have their own reasons and distortions, and we discussed some of those the last time that we met. And then, perhaps to some people surprisingly, perhaps not, you have the distortions that came to us from the orientalists. And in many cases, you see that they not only took the distortions of Bani Umayyah, to which they added the distortions of Bani al-Abbas, but in addition to which they added their own distortions to them for their own, let's call them orientalist reasons, and with all the caveats and the qualifiers that we added to the topic of orientalism. So what we wanted to do today is that, based on the very problematic image of the distortions that have surrounded the peace treaty of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam specifically, and it's kind of impossible to talk about the peace treaty without talking about Imam Al Hasan. So the distortions that have surrounded the character, the biography and the image of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam in the mainstream history, today we're going to try to untangle this from the more authentic version of the history that we can rely on. And then this will allow us to see the gap between the image that has been presented to the world versus the image that is a little bit more based on factual and realistic and objective readings of Islamic history and the life of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. So what we're going to try to do first is to finish the topic that we began with a couple of last excerpts that we had highlighted. So as soon as we are done with those, and for those of you who are just joining us, this may be a good recap, as many of the points that we raised separately here and there in a lot of the other excerpts, you're going to find them condensed in those three last excerpts. And these, in any case, are people whose names, if you're interested in this type of literature and what is being said about Islam, for instance, and Orientalist literature in general, these are names that you should be aware of. So the first one is Gerhard Gonzalman in his German book, and so this is a translation from Arabic of the German book, Allah's Sword. And so here he tells us those around Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, those around Hassan were not all the same. Some were loyal and sincere, others betrayed, others were Khawarij. So this is very important and very good, because it already tells us what kind of context Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam was working in. And they did to the Imam as they did to his father in terms of betrayal. But so long as Ali was there, and this is where you start to see the very quick way in which he's going to leave the kind of the objective version of reading history. So long as Ali was there, he tells us, everyone knew that he knew how to use his Dhul Fiqar, his sword. But now that his son had to carry the same sword, the situation was different. He was not eager to face the army of Muawiyah, even though 40,000 paid their allegiance to him out of nowhere, and very surprisingly, he tells us. But he was not happy to become caliph. In fact, Ali himself, Gonzalman writes, did not think that his son had any interest in politics and does not show any competence in managing the Islamic State. while the 40,000 soldiers waited impatiently for their orders, which were not coming from their leader, rumors were spreading that it was because he was negotiating the amount of handing over the Khilafah to Muawiyah in secret, but we will never know these secrets nor to what extent they match the truth, Gonzalman writes. When he felt that things were slipping away, Hassan ordered the army to go meet that of Muawiyah, while he would remain back to lead the prayers among the Shia of Ali. But as the reports of defeat reached, he was forced, please keep all of these points in mind, because we're going to compare this version of history with what we read in Tabari and Yaqubi and elsewhere. He was forced to rush to his forces, but upon reaching, he saw that his army was demotivated and hopeless. They argued with him and they injured him. He realized that he had lost a military battle and the political one, so he decided to deal with Muawiyah immediately by sending his messenger, telling him that he was giving up, so Muawiyah answered that he was ready to compensate him generously. Again, a very important point to keep in mind. And it was a matter of convention that Hassan would designate the appropriate amount, so he asked for 5 million dirham once, in addition to being given the profits of a Persian region, so on and so forth. And because this decision had repercussions on his brother Hussein as well, we needed to understand that half of the amounts he was asking for were to justify to him his betrayal, in addition to the fact that he had given up the rights of the household of the Prophet out of his duty to obey the command of Allah, that through him God will make peace between two fighting sides among the Muslims. And we're going to come back to that today. After his sermon, the people of Kufa no longer cared about him or what he had to say, and they considered his brother as having become one of his victims and having been betrayed. And Muawiyah ensured that Hassan and Hussein were undesirable in Kufa, so he pushed them out and they went back to Medina. From that point on, they no longer represented any threat to the legitimate ruler. Very important points to keep in mind. And then we have the very famous Orientalist Lamens. And, I'm not going to go into a long diatribe here about who Lamens was, but generally speaking, it was kind of very difficult for this man apparently to hide his subjective and personal views as he wrote in a lot of his writings and in a lot of his articles and books. So we read, for instance, in a book called Beliefs and Institutions, since we are these days celebrating Muharram, still commemorating Muharram and Safar, the season of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. If we go to that beginning, so he's telling us about how the Shia commemorate the events of Karbala, and he says that it's a feast of mourning celebrated on the 10th of Muharram, a sort of Shia Holy Week filled with dramatic performances intended to commemorate the tragedy of Karbala. The fall of Hussein, a quite mediocre person, excites the Shias to the point of delirium, he tells us. And then if you continue to the next paragraph, among the Shia, even the most moderate, the cult of Ahlul Bayt, the people of the family, the title borne by direct descendants of Muhammad, is followed to the detriment of the veneration in which Islam holds its prophet. In other words, you can see the repetition of, let's say, the Salafi or the Wahhabi claims against the Shia that they do not respect or venerate the Holy Prophet, to the point that you see and you witness them respecting Imam Ali or Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, for instance. So Muhammad is slightly eclipsed by Ali, just as Ali is somewhat thrown into shade by Hussein. The pale hero of Karbala has completely supplanted his elder brother Hassan, whom the Shias cannot quite forgive for making terms with Muawiyah, the first Umayyad Caliph. Hussein is deemed to have sacrificed himself voluntarily in order to reconcile God with humanity and thus effect, as it were, a redemption. And so this is all you see. This is his own interpretation that he is adding to the theology of the Shia. You're not going to find this in any Shia book, but yet, it's presented in that manner. Muhammad, Ali, and Hussein form a Shia trinity. The first named, so Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, represents revelation, Ali interpretation or the esoteric meaning, the ta'wil of the Quran, and Hussein the redemption. So this is what Lamens says. And then we have his famous entry in one of the most important references on Islam in the world, the Brill Encyclopedia of Islam. So he's the one who wrote the entry here on Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. So if you begin with where on the left, a little bit lower, you see the red spot there. So he begins talking about the personality of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, and about whom he says sensuality and a lack of energy and intelligence seem to have been the fundamental features of Hassan's character. After the premature death of Fatima, he was not on particularly good terms with his father and brothers. He spent the best part of his youth in making and unmaking marriages. About 100 are enumerated. These easy morals earned him the title Mitlaq, the divorcer, and involved Ali in serious enmities. Hassan, moreover, proved a thorough spendthrift, so wasteful. He allotted to each of his wives a considerable establishment. We thus see how the money was scattered during the Khilafah of Ali, already much impoverished. He was present at the Battle of Siffin without taking any active part in it. He took no further interest in public affairs during the lifetime of his father, so he claims. After the assassination of Ali, Hassan was proclaimed caliph in Iraq. His partisans tried to persuade him to renew the war against the Syrians. Their importunities, so their insistence, upset the plans of the indolent, the lazy Hassan, and he henceforth thought only of treating with Muawiyah. They led to a rupture between himself and the Iraqis. The latter ended by severely wounding their nominal sovereign, so not really a sovereign, not really their ruler, only nominally. From this time on, Hassan's one idea was to come to an arrangement with the Umayyads. Muawiyah left to himself the task of fixing his price for the renunciation of the Khilafah. Besides a pension of 2 million dirhams for his brother Hussein, once again you see this perpetuated, Hassan asked for himself a sum, if you continue on the other column, of 5 millions and the revenues of a district in Persia during his lifetime. The Iraqis later opposed the execution of his last clause. All his demands were granted, and the grandson of the Prophet had the impertinence, so the rudeness, to express publicly his regret that he had not asked for double. He left the Iraq amid the jeers of the people to retire to Medina. There he resumed his life of pleasure and foolish dissipation. Muawiyah agreed to pay the expense, only stipulating in return that Hassan should not disturb the peace of the realm. At a meeting at Adra, he had previously forced him to renew publicly his renunciation of power. Henceforth, Muawiyah ceased to trouble him, being reassured by his negligible and indolent, once again, so lazy personality. Dissension continued to reign among the Alids, however. Hassan was not on good terms with Hussein, while both were in a league against Ibn Hanafiya and other children of Ali. Hassan died at Medina of consumption, probably hastened by his excesses. An attempt has been made to throw the responsibility for his end on Muawiyah. In addition to the stain which would thus be thrown upon the Umayyad, the object of this charge was to justify the title Shaheed and Sayyid of the Martyrs given in compliment to Fatima's insignificant son. Only Shi'i writers, or those particularly favorable to the Alids, dare openly voice such a grave accusation. It at the same time gave an opportunity to implicate the family of Ash'ath ibn Qais, detested by the Shia on account of his share in the coup of Siffin. We don't have time to go through those details. Muawiyah was not the man to commit an unnecessary crime, and the frivolous Hassan had long become quite inoffensive. His life was a burden only on the treasury of the Umayyad, which was beset by his constant appeals. The sigh of relief heaved by Muawiyah on hearing of his decease can be readily understood. He probably died in 49 after Hijrah at the age of about 45. By his death, his brother Hussein became head of the Alids. In the later history of this faction, so in Shia in general, we generally find that the numerous descendants of Hassan have to give way to the more enterprising Husainids, so the progeny of Imam al-Hussein. So of course he's referring here to the Imams being of the progeny of Imam al-Hussein, and so they were more enterprising than the progeny of Imam al Hasan alayhi salam. The two families did not agree any better than their ancestors had done. So in short, this gives us, and this concludes our excursion into some of the writings of the Orientalists and their claims as we said, that they not only repeated from Bani Umayyah and Bani al-Abbas, but to which they added their own, unable in a lot of cases, such as these and other ones, to perhaps hide their hatred towards Islam and the Holy Prophet and his family, which continues to represent him. So with all of this in mind, the conclusions that we reach from all of this, and we talked a little bit about it at the last time, is that we notice a lack of analytical reading of history from the Orientalists, first and foremost. Secondly, there is a clear, simple repetition, and there is a picking and choosing of what they decide to report and what they decided not to report, and we will see much of that today. And then, of course, here, as we said, perhaps this is going to remind us of the responsibility of the Muslims themselves about the manner in which they have reported and they have kept the image of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam in their books and all the events related to the treaty between the Imam and Muawiyah. So what do we want to cover today? So if we can go to the next page, please. So with all of this in mind, what are we going to try to cover? Today's lecture. We want to understand, and here are the big questions. What actually happened? What did the peace treaty include in terms of provisions and conditions? What were the reasons, what were the motives for Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam to engage in this type of agreement with Muawiyah? Does this mean that the Imam was the type of man that we saw related, the biography that we saw of him, someone who is cowardly, someone who stays away from any confrontation, who wants to, at any price, avoid any confrontation with Muawiyah, avoid war, not enter into battle, whatever that may cost, and give up in exchange for the luxuries of this world, in exchange for, his habits of being a womanizer, for instance, and to acquire as much money simply for his own personal gains. So we want to compare those two images, the one that we're going to present today versus the one that the world has been reading about and hearing about and learning about concerning Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. And perhaps, and this is to me, inshallah, an important point for you, I also want you to keep in mind not only perhaps the distorted version that we hear in mainstream Islamic history, or for instance from Orientalists from outside of Islam, but I also want you to compare the version that we're going to be presenting today with perhaps things that you also hear from Shia lecturers and historians and speakers. Because at the end of the day, what we want to see is if there was an agreement, a treaty, a truce between Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam and Muawiyah, can we convincingly agree that this was the right strategic move on behalf of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam? Or was there something perhaps that he could have done better? And we want to reach this conclusion by, for the time being, put aside the fact that we believe that this is an infallible Imam. Let's look at the history. Let's look at the material causes. Let's look at the context, the socio-political and cultural and economic context of that time, and then we will add the religious, theological layer at the end of the discussion. So let us begin with a summary of the chronology of the events. What actually happened? Of course, we don't really have time now to go into all of the details of the life of Imam Al Hasan, nor do we have time to go even in the details of everything that transpired and leading up to and even following the peace treaty. So here we're simply giving the high-level summary of the big events that happened. So we're going to start with, let us go to the time when Imam Ali alayhi salam has just been martyred, he passes away, and Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam emerges as the next in line. Those who were close to the Imam, everybody knew that the Imam had actually indicated that those who want to follow in his path should go to his son Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, whom he appointed as the ones to succeed him. So the Imam gives a sermon, and he talks about Imam Ali alayhi salam, and then he talks about himself, and he clearly presents himself as the Khalifa of the Islamic world if the people are to choose him as such. And right away, those people gave their allegiance to Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. So this is happening in Kufa, this is happening in Iraq. And very quickly, the people of Iraq gave their allegiance to Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. So you have the people of Kufa, you have the people of Basra, Iraq in general, you have the Hijaz in general giving their allegiance to Imam Al Hasan, you have Mecca, Medina, Yemen, Persia, that entire area of the Islamic world, that geopolitical area of the Islamic world, everyone agrees and recognizes that Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam is the legitimate Khalifa of the Islamic world. The only exception to this is the area under Muawiyah and his rule, and that is the general area of the Levant, Al-Sham. The problem, however, is that the context when Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam takes over is a very complex and difficult context. We have a lot more disunity, a lot more fragmentation, a lot more contradiction within the people who make up the population under Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. You have the Khawarij who are working very hard, who are against Imam Ali alayhi salam and therefore Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, but also against Muawiyah, except that Muawiyah has already created alliances with many of them, and one of his alliances ended with the martyrdom of Imam Ali alayhi salam. So you have the Khawarij who are in a strong position, many of whom are actually within the population under Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. Then you have Muawiyah, who is a lot bolder and feeling a lot stronger now that Imam Ali alayhi salam has passed away, and his son, who is over 30 years younger than Muawiyah, Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, emerges as the Khalifa at that time. And then you have Muawiyah, who's already working, and he's been working for a while with many of the governors and those who are influential in the general area of Iraq. So in Basra, in Kufa, and elsewhere in Iraq. So Muawiyah has been hard at work doing all of this. This is the general context when Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam takes over. Right away, and we don't have time to go through these and the tone and the contents, and inshallah one day we can actually delve into the details and actually read those letters. Letters are exchanged between Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam and Muawiyah. The tone from Imam Al Hasan is quite explicit and direct with Muawiyah. And the letters change in tone. Some of them are a little bit harsher, some of them are a little bit more loose and flexible. But generally speaking, Muawiyah was open to the idea of allowing Imam Al Hasan to maintain his khilafah over a certain area, the entire part of the world who have given their allegiance to him, while he accepts Muawiyah as the legitimate ruler and khalifa over the area that is already under him, which is the entire Sham. And of course, at that time, Muawiyah is fighting hard to control the entire area with the northern Africa, which is Egypt and beyond. And so Muawiyah is basically saying, let me be and you can be too. And you can become a khalifa and I can become a khalifa. That was kind of what is implied in some of the writings of Muawiyah. Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam completely rejects this. And he does not go that route, and he tells him very openly and frankly that his duty is to fight Muawiyah. And the only option in front of Muawiyah is to accept Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam as the legitimate ruler and khalifa of the Islamic world, and to fall within the fold of the Islamic Ummah, or to fight the Imam because he is openly and explicitly objecting to the rule of the Imam as the Khalifa. So at this time, the Imam starts to remind his people that the war with Muawiyah never really ended and that Muawiyah is still a danger. The people don't really react. They're very passive. They are exhausted, if we want to look at it from a kind of military, strategic, social, cultural point of view. They're exhausted from the wars. There were 3 consecutive wars over 5 years that did a lot of damage to especially the people living in that area of the world. So the Basra, Kufa, and so on and so forth. And generally speaking, a lot of people are just exhausted from the war in general. And they're being very passive and lazy. When the Imam speaks to them, no one really reacts. So finally, the Imam tells them that Muawiyah has started advancing against them. And Muawiyah actually writes to the Imam, and then he starts moving his armies towards Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. The Imam gives a sermon in which he openly tells his people and tells them that you are under war, you are being directly attacked by Muawiyah, so rise and get ready. And basically no one moved in Kufa when the Imam gave his sermon. No one even spoke a word, because no one is accepting or receiving well the message of the Imam that we need to rise and fight Muawiyah. And this is kind of an announcement of things to come, just to give you an indication. When the leader is speaking to tens of thousands and not a single person dares to move, because they really don't want to embark on a new battle. And then some of the big leaders and influential people and companions of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam spoke. They gave sermons too. They told the people that they are being cowards if they will not even protect themselves in self-defense against Muawiyah. Muawiyah is abusive and transgressing, and he's the one who's attacking. And so finally some people start moving, and they say that they're going to be preparing themselves to join the army of the Imam. And the Imam goes along with his commanders and leaders, and they go a little bit outside the city in Nukhayla, where a little bit outside of Kufa, waiting for the people to come. And in some reports we are told that they waited for about 10 days in that region, in that area, where about 4,000 people finally gathered. 4,000 from an army that was expected to be in the tens of thousands. So the Imam went back to Kufa and he gave other sermons, and some of his companions went with him, and they pushed the people and convinced them. And then finally, after a while, they went back to Nukhayla, and you have an army that was between 40 and 60,000 that gathered under Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, that is supposed to counter the advance of the armies of Muawiyah at that time. So Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, he dispatches a group of about 12,000 soldiers to go and be the first front line of attack against the army of Muawiyah. And he appoints Ubaydullah ibn Abbas as the leader of that group of 12,000, and he appoints two others to become the commanders in case something were to happen to Ubaydullah ibn Abbas. And one of them is Qais ibn Sa'd, a very important man, companion of the Holy Prophet, was with Imam Ali alayhi salam, and now he was fighting with Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, a valiant, strong warrior, brave, from Al-Ansar, one of the leaders of Al-Ansar. And so that group leaves and to start fighting the armies of Muawiyah. And so of course on the side of Muawiyah, he's also dispatched Bisr bin Arta'a and others to be their front line. And before, when Muawiyah saw that this is actually, perhaps Muawiyah did not think that there would be an actual confrontation. When he saw that the Imam is actually serious and he has actually gathered an army of between 40 and 60,000 to face him, and the first lines of attack are of 12,000, and they are actually starting to fight, he changes his strategy and he starts sending bribery letters. So he sends letters to the commanders of that dispatched group that Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam sent, and he basically promises them, he tells them that I'm already in secret negotiations with Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, and it's just a matter of time before he's going to accept a peace between us. So why are you fighting in the first place? And at the end of this is only going to be peace, so you're fighting a futile war. If you surrender and come to me with the men under you, then I am going to reward you with basically a reward of 1 million. And if you accept to do it now, there is 500,000 waiting for you immediately. And then when I reach Kufa, there is another 500,000 that will be given to you. This is sent to, of course, they don't know about this, and this is sent late at night to both Ubaydullah ibn Abbas and Qais. So when the army wakes up in the morning, they see that Ubaydullah ibn Abbas has disappeared. He's nowhere to be found, along with 4,000 men that he has taken with him. And Qais is left there, and he gives a sermon. He takes over the leadership of that dispatched group, army, and he basically tells them, this is not anything surprising. No good has ever come from these people. Their father fought the Holy Prophet in the Battle of Badr, and then their brother took money from Imam Ali alayhi salam to buy servants and use it because he felt entitled to it when he wasn't. And now you have him. And Ubaydullah ibn Abbas, he's done quite a few things. He had just been, he was in Imam Ali alayhi salam had sent him to Yemen, and in the battle he ran away from the army of Muawiyah, and he left his 2 sons to be slaughtered by Bisr ibn Arta'ah, who was under Muawiyah, and now he was going back to Muawiyah for a sum of money. So Muawiyah knows how to deal with these people, and everyone from them has a price. So he left everything and he left. And at that time, Muawiyah had already dispatched his men to go infiltrate the army of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, to tell them that before even the agreement came from Ubaydullah bin Abbas or Qais, they were telling the people that there were secret negotiations going on between Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam and Muawiyah, and that there would be peace, that Ubaydullah bin Abbas and Qais had agreed to take sums of money. In fact, some of them were also spreading the rumors that Qais had already been killed, because a lot of people knew that Qais was not going to be easily convinced. So the other rumor spread about Qais that he was already killed. Ubaydullah had left. The army was basically, no one was fighting. When this was, of course, not true, because at that time Qais took the men who were left under him and he went and he fought. And he defeated the group under Bisr ibn Arta at that time who retreated from their area. And he did not want to give up fighting, but he knew that things were actually happening elsewhere too. And so there's a back and forth happening at that time. Let's finish the story of Qais and then go back to Kufa. So what happens is they wait for the instructions of the Imam. They hear that things are really not going well from Kufa. In the end, Qais goes back to Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara with the men who join him, and then he gives them the choice. Do they want to continue fighting under him, or do they choose to live and give their kind of allegiance and accept the allegiance to Muawiyah? And they say, we don't want to fight anymore. And so that fighting stops with Qais, who really did not want to stop fighting, and he wanted to fight until the end. And then we go back now to Kufa. So in Kufa, these rumors are being spread about Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam and about the leaders of his army, and this completely, as you can understand, destabilizes and demotivates and deflates the army of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. And this is when Muawiyah is already starting to write to a lot of the people who are considered very influential. Some of them are the heads of tribes, the governors, and he's writing to them at the same time, telling them that basically your war is over. And this is the manner in which Muawiyah has always worked. And if you go back to Safin and other wars, you see that he uses a lot of trickery and these kinds of rumor spreading, propaganda to his advantage, whether it's happening or not. And people should have learned, but they did not. And so at that time, the people started turning against Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam very quickly. The rumors were actually working, and a lot of people were believing what was being said. The heads of tribes started writing to Muawiyah, telling him if he wanted them to, they would tie up Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, or kill him, or bring him to Muawiyah. Whatever he wanted them to do, they would do. And so at that time, we are told Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam started to wear his shield even when he stood to pray in front of his army. So this is probably where you would think that a military leader is the most safe amongst his men leading his army. And we are told that Imam Al Hasan, even in prayer, he would stand and wear his shield. And the Imam was actually, arrows were shot at the Imam during that time. History, based on my knowledge, does not tell us who's shooting the arrows, because they could be men sent from Muawiyah to shoot them, but it still looks like it's being shot from the men of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. In any case, as we said, there are Khawarij, there are those who are easily bribed and bought off. And so Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, after all of this happens, Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam is actually attacked, and he delivers a sermon, and then he goes back to his tent, and they say basically Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, because of these rumors that they're hearing, he has become a kafir. So you can imagine this is most likely being spread by either the Khawarij or the men of Muawiyah, but it's working. And so there's an attack on the tent of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. We are told that he was sitting on his prayer mat inside his tent, and every single item in that tent was taken. Even the prayer mat on which he was sitting, and the Imam was attacked, and he was jabbed or stabbed either with a dagger, an arrow, or a pick. And the Imam escapes at that point. He rides his horse, and there's a group of men who are with him, who fight with the Imam, and he goes to an area called Madlam Sabat. And regardless of whether this was a strong hold of the Khawarij or not, clearly there were Khawarij who were there, and a man in that area was able to reach the Imam and to stab the Imam. And the stab, fortunately, did not reach the vital organs of the Imam, so it was either on his side or on his thigh. And the report that it went on his thigh says that it went to the bone. You could see the bone of the Imam. And in one narration that it was a poisoned dagger that hit the Imam, and the Imam started bleeding profusely to the point where a lot of people thought the Imam was killed. But he was in fact carried to the nearby region of Al-Mada'in, where he was brought into the castle of Al-Mada'in, and he was treated for a number of days to perhaps a full month. During that time, Muawiyah continues to work on the people of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. And as we said, many of the people thought that their leader perhaps had died. He was actually recovering during that time. And there are back and forth exchanges. So Muawiyah is sending men to the castle where Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam is recovering. But those men, history tells us, when they would leave, they would say, praise be to God that, we have finally reached a peace agreement between Muawiyah and Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. And the people would actually believe, when this was not the case yet. It had not happened yet. But the people were so eager. People were so eager to believe that a peace treaty was reached, because they don't really want to fight under Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, Muawiyah, and enter in another battle. So during this time, and we have quotes from Al-Tabari and others. Al-Tabari in this case, he writes, when Al Hasan became all alone, he accepted the treaty. And we are told here, if you go into the more detailed versions of history, we are told that at the end, and so I'm explicitly not going into the details here, okay? We know that there's a back and forth in history, and we know that at the end, Muawiyah, when he sent his last messenger, he sent him with a blank document that he had signed, the bottom of that blank document, and the messenger tells Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, whatever conditions you stipulate and you write in here, I have already agreed to them if you accept that I become the Khalifa. Okay? So this is the general context in which the Imam wrote the peace treaty, the peace truce, the agreement with Muawiyah. Now, why would the Imam not continue to fight? Okay, now this is where we have to get into a little bit more of the analytical component. There's a context piece that we have to keep in mind, and then there is the potential outcomes of such a fight or not. The context piece is, and this is not generally stuff that people talk about too much, but we need to mention it because these were important factors. If you look at the geopolitical situation of the Islamic world at that time, you would see that it had expanded, it was a lot larger and a lot stronger, but it was also a direct threat now to other empires, including the Eastern Roman Empire, which was waiting to attack the Islamic world. Attack in the sense that they knew that there is weakness and trouble and disunity going on internally, and the attack would come most likely from the side of where Muawiyah was, in that area of the world, but it would obviously have very big repercussions on the Islamic world as a whole. And it would take back the Islamic world, many, many steps behind. If you would go back to the time of the Holy Prophet and then all the work that was done since then, you would see that geopolitically, this would be a very big blow to the Islamic world if it were now suddenly known that it is in a state of disunity, in a civil war once again, and it's an easy prey that can just be taken over by any area. That's one thing to keep in mind. And in fact, if you go back in history and you read, fast forward, when Muawiyah accepted the deal, so he goes, he accepts the deal, he comes back, we are told that he was told right away, he was informed that a very large army from the Romans was advancing towards him. And so he rushed to send a very large gift. We are told 100,000 dinars or more to the emperor just as a gift. And the emperor asked his soldiers to stop and no longer advance. So this idea that the Islamic world was at any moment open to being attacked needs to be kept in mind. Let's call this the external affairs component. Internally, I don't think we need to go into a lot more details given the version that we presented, which is the lack of unity, the lack of loyalty, the contradiction in the ideologies of the people who are supposed to be the internal population under Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. Would they actually unite and obey the Imam when he asks them to do something or not? Can they be relied upon or not? And as we saw, they could not be relied upon, not in this manner. In addition to the fact, of course, as we said, that there was general fatigue, the 3 big wars in 5 years. And here we are also told that most recently in Kufa and surrounding areas, we have about 20,000 people who had just entered Islam and they were not Arabs. So that combination basically means that 1, they did not know much about Islam, 1, and 2, they did not really have any loyalty here or there yet. To them, it's kind of a mess. There's kind of maybe tribal wars or family wars between people, but they could easily be taken one side or the other because they're new and there's not much loyalty there yet. And Shaykh al-Mufid adds to this when he talks about this. He says the majority of the people were not motivated by, ideological, ethical, religious principles and values. They were motivated by personal interests or tribal concerns. The head of the tribe says, that's what we're doing, that's what we do, right? And so this is all important factors to keep in mind. Now, if we go to the potential outcomes, what potentially could happen if the Imam decides to continue to fight Muawiyah at that time? The realistic outcome, and we need to accept this, the most realistic outcome is that the Imam alayhi salam, Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, would be killed. And not only he would be killed, his family would be killed. Those of his good companions and loyal companions would be killed. Imam Al Hussein alayhi salam and others would all be killed because of the way in which, as you can tell, from a military standpoint, from a strategic standpoint, from a social standpoint, politically, the people are not with the Imam to the point where they are going to fight with him until the end. And those who are with the Imam, perhaps there's a better way and there's a better course to deal with this than to jeopardize and risk everything and go to war if all of this could mean potentially that Islam is going to be annihilated or destroyed. And then you have the version of Islam that Bani Umayyah are promoting. This is the only realistic outcome and the point of the behavior of the Imams. So you take Imam Ali, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, all the way to Imam Al Hasan Al Askari alayhi salam. Everything they do is not for themselves, and it's not to leave some sort of military or political or social legacy. It's to preserve this religion that has been brought from the Holy Prophet to humanity to the extent possible to keep it in its most genuine form so that you can actually communicate it to humanity to guide them. And all of this, these are just stumbling blocks in the way. So whatever is going to allow them to maximize the benefits of preserving this religion and moving it forward, that's going to be the best course of action. And so in this case, if the Imam feels that if you split the Islamic world and give Bani Umayyah their part of Islam, you have just said that there are 2 legitimate formats of Islam. And if there is a war such as there is now, and one of them takes over the other, then it's very clear that you've weakened or destroyed the Islamic world in itself. There is no more Islamic world. There are 2, warring, battling areas or groups, that's 1. And 2, if that group becomes victorious, then there is no more ability to recognize where does genuine, authentic Islam begin and end. Because now, legitimately, we have recognized that this is as legitimate as that, for instance. Or if war happens and they are annihilated and they are killed, then nothing good comes out of it for the Islamic world. And so, the other factor to keep in mind is that Muawiyah had spread the rumors and had already indicated, and the people were aware of this, that Muawiyah was interested was open to, that's the majority of the people thought, was open to peace. And so if the Imam is the one who goes to war, it looks like the Imam is the one who is moving towards war, and Muawiyah is the man of peace. The propaganda had worked, and the people who no longer wanted to fight were using that as a pretext. That if Muawiyah wants peace, then why are we fighting him? And of course, the Islamic instructions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Holy Prophet in any case, وَإِن جَنَحُوا لِلسَّلْمِ فَجْنَحْ لَهَا. If they lean towards peace, then lean towards peace. If there is any peaceful alternative, then that is always going to be the better alternative. And of course, Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam is going to be the one modeling and personifying these Islamic teachings more than anyone else. And so in this case, if the Imam is going to put himself in a situation where it's between peace and war, and Muawiyah is going to look like not only did he beat the Imam, but he beat the Imam after he had presented a peace treaty to the Imam and the Imam had rejected it, then that's one more stab and jab and kind of attack on the reputation of the Islam that is being presented by Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam to the world. And then in that case, Muawiyah becomes the legitimate Khalifa who was able to become victorious and take it fair and square from someone else, and he becomes the legitimate Khalifa, and his version of Islam, as we said, becomes the official version of Islam in the world. The other point that I would end this with, and then we go into the conditions of the treaty, is that if you go back in history and you look at the uprisings that actually took place in history, in Islamic history, there are dozens upon dozens of them. And these are the unsuccessful uprisings. And you have the Thawrat of Al Hasaniyin, you have the Thawrat, the revolutions, the uprisings of Zayd, for instance, and his son. You have the uprisings that happened at the time of Al-Mukhtar. You have the uprisings that took place throughout the lives of the Imams, especially Imam Al-Sajjad, Al-Baqarah, Al-Sadiq, Al-Kadhim, all the way to Imam Al-Askari alayhi salam. How many of them have you heard about? Not many. Because the end result, and the Imams often spoke about this, they knew that even though the intentions of those people were in a lot of cases noble and good, you need to be able to kind of do a cost-benefit analysis and see, is this going to be worth it? And is this going to give you a desired enough outcome that it justifies this specific sacrifice or this specific action or not? And in a lot of cases, what we see is that while the intentions were good and all of these efforts were being made, not all the factors were being taken into consideration, and it amounted to not much. Socially and politically and in the course of history, not much happened out of it. And of course, we would not expect someone like Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, with his savvy, with his penetrating insight into history and into the future of this ummah, to engage in a futile battle against Muawiyah and then nothing comes out of it. And this was the secret of the Battle of Karbala, that Imam Hussein alayhi salam knew that this is going to be sufficient and the right move at the right time to generate a revival in Islam. And so we need to keep that in mind every time we look at the decisions made by the Imams and try to understand in what way is this a revival of this religion that the Imam chooses to do this or that, okay? To keep in mind. So, in addition to all of this, let us now look at the actual conditions of the treaty between Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam and Muawiyah. 4 factors are listed here. The first one has to do with the religious conditions. Keep in mind that we don't have today one document that tells us this is the peace treaty between Imam Al Hasan and Muawiyah. So this needs digging. This needs to go through, different sources of history and be put together. And if someone does that, these are some of the conditions that were stipulated from Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, which I have grouped into these themes. The first one is the religious theme. Amongst the conditions that Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam stipulated, he said that Muawiyah would have to rule the Islamic world according to the book of God and the tradition of the Holy Prophet. And we don't have time to comment on all of these, but these are very important conditions. You have to keep them in mind. 2, he does not act as a legal witness in any, let's say, legal proceedings. Okay, he is not recognized as having any legal weight. 3, that the companions and followers of Ali would be safe and protected in themselves, their properties, their money, and their families. So this is a protection of ideology, a protection of a group of people who were persecuted in that world, the Shia of Ali alayhim as-salam, who were very much persecuted, and we can't go into the details now. The Imam is saying that those people are going to be protected from that. They have an immunity. That a general pardon, very important. You can't go back in history and seek someone's blood for something that they have done. A general pardon would be granted to all people from that point on, from the point in time when Muawiyah accepts this deal, for anything that had happened before. So basically we're starting a blank slate, especially to the people of Iraq and the followers of Ali. And of course here the Imam is protecting once again the Shia of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Then he says that he does not call himself Amir al-Mu'mineen. Muawiyah is not allowed to say that. This has 2 meanings. The first one is that this title is actually given by the Holy Prophet only to Imam Ali alayhi salam. As an honorific title, it comes from God to Imam Ali alayhi salam. No one else is allowed to use it. That's 1. 2, as important as that, the actual function performed by Amir al-Mu'mineen. So you shall not call yourself, because you are not Amir al-Mu'mineen. You are not the one who has the Imra. You're not the one who has sovereignty over the believers. Okay? Very important condition. Keep in mind. Then he continues. He does not insult or curse Imam Ali alayhi salam publicly and on the pulpits. That he only mentions Ali alayhi salam in praise or not at all. That he does not conspire to do harm against Hassan, Hussein, or any of their family members or the family members of the Holy Prophet in secret or in public, and that he does not scare any of them wherever they may be. Let's consider all of these conditions that fall under the religious factor. Political factor. Muawiyah would not be allowed to appoint anyone as a successor. 2, Muawiyah is to hand over the Khilafah to Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam when he dies. And if Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, as we said, he is much younger, why would he even say this? And if Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam is not alive when Muawiyah dies, then the Khilafah goes automatically to his brother Imam Al Hussein alayhi salam. Okay, so these can be considered the political conditions. The humanitarian or social conditions. That all the people in the Islamic world, in the words of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, shall live in security and peace, whether they are in Hijaz or Yemen or Iraq or elsewhere, which just tells us the extent and amount of persecution that people, for no other reason than just being people living in that kind of tyrannical regime, were subjected to. And so the Imam is making sure that this does not happen. But of course, it's nowhere near the treatment of anyone who is associating with Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And then financially, very important points, because as you saw when we read the excerpts from the Orientalists, they talk a lot about this, that he distributes 1 million dirham over the widows and the orphans of those killed by his wars against Imam Ali alayhi salam. So when he asks for 1 million, the Imam is not asking for him personally. He is saying that the 1 million, Muawiyah has to distribute it directly to those, the families of those he killed. He caused the killing of those people. He is responsible for their widows and their orphans. 1. 2. The Imam says that he himself, Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, shall continue to manage autonomously, so Muawiyah has no say in this, autonomously and entirely, the treasury of Kufa, estimated at about 5 million dirham, as well as the kharaj of Ahwaz and Dar Abjad, which was, as we said last time, under Basra and some other areas. Why? We are told that those regions had entered into Islam without any fighting, without any wars. Those people had entered into Islam and said, we are now Muslims. And for those of you who have been following these lectures for a while, you know that there's a difference. when people enter into Islam, you cannot deal with the taxes or the kharaj that comes out of those lands in the same manner as an area with whom you had a battle. The Quran makes that very clear. That money has to be given back to the Holy Prophet, right? So the Quran is very clear in this, and we've talked about this in the past. We can't go into those details, but those areas had entered. So the Imam is applying a very clear and well-known at that time Islamic rule, which is those areas you cannot even claim to use them because you're not the Holy Prophet or someone who represents him. So it doesn't fall under the law which says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, the areas which have entered themselves, by their own accord, without any war, without any battle, without any fighting, they themselves enter and they have taxes to pay. Those taxes go back to the Holy Prophet to do with as he pleases. It doesn't fall under the rest of the conventions that were well known at that time. So the Imam is clearly saying those areas, Ahwaz and Dar Abjard and other areas, all of that comes back to him because he is the one who is going to distribute that. And as for Kufa, he already has his hand over the treasury of Kufa. So in other words, the Imam is not completely letting go of everything. The Imam is maintaining a rule. The Imam is maintaining an ability to provide for the people under him and to administer the affairs of that area that is under his sovereignty and his people. Very important to keep in mind, which is completely different from saying the Imam is taking money so that he goes to spend on himself and in his luxuries and on his wives, for instance. And that Muawiyah would send him 100 to 2,000 dirhams every year, and that Muawiyah would not give Bani Abd Shams, so basically Bani Umayyah, and more than he gives to Bani Hashim. So he needs to deal with everyone equally and fairly, which he was not known to do, as had started from the time of the previous Khulafa as well. And of course, the last condition, that Muawiyah would commit to all of these conditions publicly and to swear to them bil-ayman al-mughalladha, as he says, and to swear to them in the strongest manner before God. These were the conditions. Okay, and as we said, we don't have time to go through an extensive commentary more than we did about these conditions and their importance. Now, when this reached Muawiyah, that Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam had agreed that there was from now on a peace truce between Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam and Muawiyah. When Muawiyah heard, we are told that right away he said a very loud takbir, and there are people who came and they heard Muawiyah saying this, saying Allahu Akbar. And when they came and they asked him, he said, as I got news that Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam has agreed to this peace situation between us, I am reminded of a narration from the Holy Prophet in which he says that when Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, as we said in the last lecture, Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, when he was young, we are told in the orientalist reports and elsewhere, that the Holy Prophet would have said about Imam Al Hasan that this son of mine is a master. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to unite two great groups of Muslims through him. So obviously, the Holy Prophet is praising Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam for a role that he will play much later in history. And so Muawiyah is saying at that time, Allahu Akbar, I am reminded now that this has come to me from Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. I am reminded of this tradition from the Holy Prophet that he said so and so about Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. How authentic is this narration? There is a possibility that it is authentic, but there is a very strong possibility that it is not, and that is fabricated specifically by Muawiyah at that time, who was known to fabricate these. And this is to counter a very damaging hadith, authentic, that everybody knew at that time, that was being used again and again against Muawiyah. And that hadith is that the Holy Prophet, when he looked to Ammar ibn Yasir and he told him, a great companion of the Holy Prophet, and he told him, as for you, Ammar, it's the transgressing group that shall kill you. Ammar shall be killed by the unjust transgressing group, the group that attacks without merit. And so clearly, in a lot of people's minds, because those who knew of that hadith knew that it was Muawiyah's army who killed Ammar ibn Yasir, who was fighting with Imam Ali alayhi salam, he needed to do something, Muawiyah, to counter the damage of that hadith, and this was his opportunity. So now he was saying that, and he was praising God for making him the one through which two great groups of Muslims, so he is a Muslim, he is not a transgressing group against the Muslims, he is a Muslim recognized by the Holy Prophet as such, and he is thanking God that the prophecy about Imam Al Hasan happened through him, as he says in his narration. Any case, this is a quick commentary on that hadith. Now, the next point is, and this is where I would like you to stay with me, please, here, important. I think this is a part that we hear a lot about, in which Muawiyah, we are told, says, these conditions that we just read of Imam Al Hasan, these conditions of Al Hasan are under my 2 feet. Very, very problematic, very damaging for any one of us who hears this. What happened? How could Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam stipulate and try to impose conditions on someone which basically become the justification for not going to war against them? And then as soon as the conditions are written and he pretends to agree to them, then right away he says, these conditions are under my 2 feet. So what did we accomplish here? Nothing. So the big question is, and unfortunately this does not seem to be a question that is addressed or talked a lot about, when were these words uttered by Muawiyah? When did he say, these conditions of Al Hasan are under my 2 feet? Did Muawiyah come and accept the conditions and stand in front of the people right away with Imam Al Hasan, as some people try to present, and oftentimes our own lecturers and our own books say this? As soon as the conditions were written, Muawiyah stands in front of the people, Imam Al Hasan delivers a lecture, and then Muawiyah delivers a lecture, and right away he says that. Many have said that, many have written that. History does not say it that way. If you go back in history, yes, Muawiyah did say those words, but when did he say them? And so that we don't keep the suspense going and we're running out of time here. In short, Muawiyah said those words when Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam was killed. After he got rid of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, Muawiyah said those words. And here is the important point to keep in mind, and the important factors to keep in mind. When did Muawiyah and Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam reach this agreement, and Muawiyah is publicly standing in front of the people and swearing to God in the strongest terms that he's going to respect those conditions? This was 10 years before Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam was martyred, right? And so the big question is, what happens during that 10-year period? After Muawiyah accepts those conditions, and the time he says, these conditions of Imam Al Hasan are under my feet, what happens? And this is where I want to bring you back to the words that we read from the excerpts of the orientalists, who are simply repeating many of them or just making them up in some cases in a distorted way. They basically say Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam went back to Medina, and there was a period of relative peace and tranquility. And this is the key. And this is the key we need to keep in mind. So when Muawiyah says that these conditions of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam are under my feet, if you read the timeline, the chronology of the events, what happens right after those words of Muawiyah? The cursing of Imam Ali alayhi salam begins on the pulpits. The persecution and the killing of the Shia and the great companions of the Ummah begins once again. And Muawiyah starts moving very quickly in what we can very explicitly and openly say is breaking the conditions one by one, including the appointment or the eventual appointment of Yazid as his successor. But all of the conditions that were put by Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam had been respected perfectly Absolutely not. Not perfectly. No one is claiming that this was perfect. We're still talking about a tyrant of the type of Muawiyah that, and we talked about him and his, life and history and what he was trying to do and. But the bottom line is there were conditions that were placed upon him by Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. So our big question now is, did the peace treaty with the conditions imposed upon Muawiyah, did it work or not? Did the conditions work? Was the Imam able to get some benefit out of this peace treaty instead of fighting Muawiyah or not? And the short answer is yes. Huge benefits. The benefits is that Muawiyah was forced to openly and publicly in front of everyone respect those conditions so long as Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam was alive. And of course keep that in mind, because this is going to be the impetus and the driver for killing Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. During that time, that 10-year period, go back to the conditions that we just mentioned from the treaty of Imam Al Hasan about the money, politically, religiously, socially. Muawiyah has no choice but to respect those if he wants to remain in power. Now, this is going to be, to me at least, we have very clear indications of this. We have a distortion of how it's presented from the orientalists and from the historians, that the Imam just became basically insignificant, that there is not much to talk about. Okay, so first of all, apologies for the technical difficulty that we have with the audio here. So inshallah, we just try to recap where we stopped, and then we continue off for a few more minutes to wrap up this lecture, inshallah. So what we were saying is that these words that we keep hearing about from Muawiyah saying that the conditions of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam are under his feet, in fact, are not words that he would have uttered right away when Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam imposed those conditions on Muawiyah. Muawiyah respected to a very large extent the conditions that were imposed by Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, and I think anyone who sees and understands and studies objectively the conditions of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam can see the tremendous benefits that he would get, that other people would get directly from the actual application and implementation of these conditions and these provisions from the peace treaty with Muawiyah to the entire Islamic world. And so Muawiyah, if he wanted to keep his khilafah and to keep his status and his title as the Khalifa of the Islamic world, he had to keep the image of being someone who is respecting the conditions imposed on him by the true legitimate Khalifa of the Islamic world, who was Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. So Imam Al Hasan, in exchange for stepping down from the political position, said Muawiyah gets to rule politically the Islamic world in exchange of respecting these conditions. And these were publicly known, and if Muawiyah dares to transgress any of them, then there is a very real threat that Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam is going to go back into a situation of battle and even war with Muawiyah and destabilize his entire kingdom. And now someone might say this is an exaggeration, this is not the image that we've heard, and that's why we said this requires an attentive reading of history, especially when the Orientalists keep going back and saying the role of the Imam became very kind of subdued and negligible afterwards, and it's as though what Muawiyah transformed into an angel for the next 10 years. Absolutely not. It's because the conditions were very much real for Muawiyah if he wanted to keep his status and his title as the Khalifa of the Islamic world during that time. So, and as we said, if someone looks at all of this, the bottom line is, did the peace treaty, whatever you want to call it, the truce that was imposed by Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam on Muawiyah, did it work or not? The short answer is that to a very large extent it worked. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. But it worked. And it worked to a point where it created a breathing space, it created a relaxed environment to allow Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, Imam Al Hussein alayhi salam, their family members, their Shia, the companions, the scholars of the Ummah, the reciters of the Quran, the jurists, those who report the narrations and so on and so forth. It gave them breathing room. It allowed them to, first of all, at a very human basic level, to start living again to a certain extent, because they were persecuted. They basically could not live openly, normally like human beings, just a dignified, normal life. And then beyond that, from a religious perspective, to be able to start spreading the genuine version of Islam again, because it had kind of been eroded and disappeared. And this created a respite and a peaceful time for the people of the empire or the Ummah in general. And these were the conditions. This is the benefits and the merits of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam and his work. So those who want to give the merit and the credit to Muawiyah for having created the year of unity, all the credit goes back to Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam for having created those conditions. And if there's any merit, it entirely goes to Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, if we are to accept that narration from the Holy Prophet in which he says that it is through Imam Al Hasan, this son of mine, that two great groups of the Muslims are going to come back in unity. In any case, as we said, someone might say this is perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration. How do we know this? The historians and those who have written history, the Umayyads, the Abbasiyin, the Orientalists, as we saw, have done everything they can to basically wipe out the original version of history from anything that gives us an image of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, who is strong, who is powerful, who carries status, who has a word that can go very far, if he decides to rise up against Muawiyah again, and so on and so forth. He's been presented as someone who is more, let's say, cowardly, in the best image, not because he is like that, but because the conditions and his people forced him to become in that manner. Whereas the true version, the truer image of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam that we should have is that he strategically and smartly moved the situation based on the awfulness and horrible situation that he's in, that he has all these contradicting forces under him, the disloyalty, the disobedience, and so on and so forth. He was able still to use this very bad situation and turn it into what some scholars have referred to as a golden age of Islam during those years, because he was able to bring back and revive once again, and that was the key, the religion during that time, and through his peace treaty with Muawiyah. So, do we have examples of this or not? Very quickly, let's mention three of them. We don't have time now. The first one is, we are told that when Muawiyah went and visited Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara, the daughter of Uthman ibn Affan, the third Khalifa, came to him and she was complaining that she was no longer able to live the life that she once lived. She had the luxuries, she had the comfort, and now life was a little bit more difficult. She was unhappy with that. And basically he told her, very important answer from Muawiyah at that time, he told her, be quiet. For you to be the cousin of the Emir is a lot better, the prince or the commander is a lot better for you not to be such. And then he added, the Imam, he says the Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, Al Hasan showed us great patience and clemency, under which there is much boiling anger. So in other words, he's telling her the threat of Imam Al Hasan is there at any time, and he's still angry with us. Okay? So yes, he was patient with us and he showed us clemency, and this created the situation that we have today, and now I'm Khalifa and you're my cousin. So be grateful for that, and I will do what I can to help you, but don't push it, because Imam Al Hasan is still there and the threat and the risk is still there. Something to keep in mind. In another case, when Muawiyah came to Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara, we are told that the people came to him to visit him, because now this is the Khalifa of the Islamic world coming, and Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam did not come, nor did the majority of Bani Hashim, following Imam Al Hasan. Some of them did, some of them did not. But specifically Imam Al Hasan, the most important man in the Islamic world, the man that Muawiyah really wants to see come to greet him and see him, did not come. And so he was frustrated with that. When Abdullah ibn Zubayr came, and he is an influential man, and he is considered somewhat related to Bani Hashim through his mother. When he came, Muawiyah complained to him. He told him, I wish that Al Hasan would have come to see me just like everybody else came. And Abdullah ibn Zubayr answered Muawiyah by saying, don't delude yourself. Don't create illusions, don't hallucinate Muawiyah. Al Hasan has 100,000 swords that he can direct against you at any time. And it's not because you have become the Khalifa that the people's love towards Ahl al-Bayt or towards him has disappeared, or their hatred towards you has disappeared. Okay, so this is Abdullah ibn Zubayr and his political reading of the situation, and Muawiyah did not object to that. Okay, something to keep in mind. And just as a quick remark, 100,000, it's because the Imam actually had three big armies. He had an army in Kufa, he had an army in Basra, and he had an army closer to the border with Syria, with Sham. And that's the front armies that he had, and in that case they had actually advanced and entered into Syria at that time. But that's a discussion for another time. And then finally, after Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam went to Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara, we are told that one day the governor who Muawiyah had appointed was Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah. He appointed that man, and he started having a personal problem with one of the Shia of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam in Kufa. And so he threatened that man, and he told him that I'm going to basically bring down your house on your head. I'm going to destroy your house. That man did not waste any time. He got on his horse and he rode directly to Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam in Al-Madinah Al-Munawwara. As soon as he got there, he told him what happened. The Imam wrote a letter to Muawiyah, in which he said, "It has reached me that a dog of your dogs, one of your dogs, has threatened and is causing trouble to one of my Shia, one of my followers. So either you put him back on a leash, or I shall bring down, or I shall topple your kingdom over your head." Why is the Imam talking in this manner? Because there are conditions, and now the conditions are being broken by the governor. So basically, Muawiyah knows that his governor, if he does that, he's openly and publicly breaking the conditions of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, that the Shia shall not be persecuted for being Shia. And so Muawiyah wrote to Al-Mughira ibn Shu'bah, and he told them to back off and not harm that man. This gives us inklings, indications, and glimpses that maybe Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam was not this weak, lonely, incapacitated man who lived this life that was presented to us by the historians and their excerpts as we read. So, in any case, Muawiyah was well known at that time to be someone who found one way or another to get rid of anyone that stood in his way and in his aspirations. He got rid of Malik al-Ashtar, he got rid of Abd al-Rahman ibn Khalid ibn al-Walid, he got rid of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, those even who were his allies, who were worked with him. If they were at any time a threat, he would get rid of them, the majority of whom he killed through poisoned honey and other means, but many of them through poisoned honey. And so Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam was no different. As we said, if this is the condition under which Muawiyah has to rule, where he is constantly under the threat of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam rising against him, or there's a threat and a risk from represented by the presence of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, he needs to get rid of him. And so if you go back in the history and you read the life biography of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, we are told that there were 6 or 7 previous attempts to assassinate the Imam through poison. But the Imam would recover from them each time. So 6 or 7 times the Imam had been poisoned, but he did not pass away. And so Muawiyah wrote to the emperor of the Romans. And I don't have time to get into this, but there were certainly, and this is a topic that needs to be discussed and studied, there were certainly alliances between Bani Umayyah, specifically Muawiyah, and the Romans at that time. So Muawiyah wrote to the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire of that time, and he asked him to send him a poison that could melt the rocks. And so when the emperor received the request, he wrote back to Muawiyah refusing and saying he will not be part of killing someone with whom he is not at war. Muawiyah wrote back saying, this is the son of the man who constituted a risk to you and your empire, and who was basically calling the people to his God, referring to the Holy Prophet ﷺ. And this man is going to be doing the same, referring to Imam Al Hasan ﷺ. So the emperor accepted, and the poison was sent to Muawiyah. Muawiyah bribed the wife of Imam Al Hasan ﷺ, Ju'ada or Ju'ayda bint al-Ash'ath, and he basically told her there is 100,000 dirham as a reward for her, in addition to being allowed to marry his son Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And so she went ahead and she put the poison in the food of the Imam, and the Imam consumed that food, and the poison entered into his body. And so she went to Muawiyah asking for her reward. He gave her the 100,000, and when she stayed there asking, what about the being married to Yazid, he told her, well, we actually like our son Yazid, and we do not want you to be killing him and poisoning him as you have killed others. We want him to live. And so we cannot marry someone like our son Yazid to you after you have done this to the son of Fatima. Maybe a quick remark here about since we mentioned it a lot, a quick bracket. We mentioned a lot that they said Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam was a womanizer, since we mentioned one of his wives. And as we said, some of them have said that he married more than 200 and 300 and 350, and there's even a number of over 900. And you wonder, when do you have time to do anything else in life? But fine. So there are a lot of points to be mentioned here. This deserves to be discussed on its own. First of all, marriages at that time were happening in a completely different social, cultural context than the one we have today. Today, the majority of the people, when you mention something like marriage to them, they think of a romantic relationship that you have with someone, so on and so forth. Marriage was not seen that way at that time. Marriage was, in many cases, as a political alliance. It created proximity between families, which meant that they would no longer be at war, they would not attack each other, so on and so forth. It was not seen as a romantic move, if we want to put it in this way. It's more of a functional socio-political role. So this needs to be kept in mind. The second thing is that in the case of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, their lives are documented in very detailed manner. And this is not the case of everybody else. So in addition to that, many of the people that Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam marry, they're not the marriage in the sense that was accepted at that time. They marry someone who was a slave, for instance, and that woman would basically be freed because she becomes the wife of the Imam, which in those cases, when you go back to other people, it's not always necessarily mentioned, because these are not real marriages. These are simply marriages with your slave, which is not counted in the same way as marrying a free woman from the beginning. And then that whole topic of slavery and all of that needs to be discussed at another time. But this is the general socio-cultural context. So sometimes when you read in the biographies of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam that they married a large number, a big number, if you compared it to other important figures, personalities of similar stature in society, you would see that they were within the averages of those times, and there is absolutely nothing exceptional. And this is definitely the case of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, that if you actually go in history and look for the names of the wives of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, you would find 6 or 7 of them. And in the greatest cases, if you want to rely on objective reports, those objective reports, although there are no names mentioned, can bring that number to about 12 or 13 wives to Imam Al Hasan, 11, 12, 13 wives of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam, which is nowhere near the 200 and 300 and 900, and which can be considered very average for those times. And if you go back to lives of someone like Umar ibn al-Khattab or Talha or others, you'll see that those numbers are very, very normal numbers, and that is not a criteria for anything given the socio-cultural context of the time, but certainly does not allow anyone to refer to Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam as being the great divorcer, or being a womanizer, a mutlaq, or so on and so forth, or create enmity and problems between him and Imam Ali, or take so much money because he has to spend on his wives and his houses, and so on and so forth. So these are all just fabrications against the character assassination of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. In any case, after Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam was, after he consumed the poison, we're told that when Imam Al Hussein alayhi salam came to see him and he had consumed the poison, his color had entirely changed to a very dark sort of green, a greenish color. And the Imam chunks of his digestive system were being completely torn apart by this poison, and the Imam passes away, and he leaves as a will telling Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam that he does not want to be the cause of any disunity or bloodshed, so make sure that when this happens, and it will happen, that he accepts to bury Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam away from where the problems are and back to Al-Baqarah. Because initially the Imam was supposed to be buried right beside the grave of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and so a group of people led by Aisha came out objecting to Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam being buried beside the Holy Prophet. She really had a lot of hatred towards Imam Ali alayhi salam and his progeny, including Imam Al-Hasan. She did everything she could, and the group of men who were with her started shooting arrows at the caravan of people carrying, the procession carrying the coffin of Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, and a number of arrows actually hit the pieces of wood that were carrying Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, and perhaps that even one of them entered his body. And so Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam told Bani Hashim and those with them that as asked by Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, we shall not be cause for further bloodshed and disunity. And they turned and they buried Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam in the cemetery of Al-Baqarah. And inshallah, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we have the pleasure of seeing those graves erected and built again over the grave of Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam. I want to end very quickly with a last mention, and I'll just take a couple of minutes for this. So in addition to this, what we try to do is really just to focus on the historical, material, socio-political, cultural, religious factors. We didn't look at anything kind of supernatural. We did not add in there that there is a belief that this is a person who represents God on earth, that this is a divinely appointed Imam. So with everything we said, inshallah, it's just to give a accurate, objective, fair treatment that could be replicated, say, by an orientalist to the world. And this is a much fairer image of Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam. If we wanted to add to this, we can add a little bit. So first of all, we have the narrations, many narrations of the Prophet about who Imam Al-Hasan is. One of them, and the most famous and relevant for this case, when he says about Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam and about his brother Imam Al-Hussein, that they are both divinely appointed Imams, and that they are Imams whether they rise, which means they go into battle, or they sit, which means they decide to choose peace. Okay, so that's one. That's if you believe in the prophethood and the messengerhood of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Secondly, if you believe that Imam Ali alayhi salam is a divinely appointed Imam, then he appointed Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam as the Imam after him. Whether he occupies the political rulership or not, he is the divinely appointed Imam. And that role cannot be given or taken except by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Third point is, when you look at the life of Imam Al-Hussein alayhi salam, he approved and agreed to all the conditions and the peace treaty put in place by Imam Al-Hasan, and he respected it. And after the passing away, after the martyrdom of Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam, Imam Al-Hussein maintained those same conditions and that same peace treaty for another 10 years. Until Muawiyah died and Yazid became Khalifa, that's when Imam Al-Hussein became public and open about his confrontation. Until then, the Imam continued in the same manner and with the same policies that were put in place by Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam. So no one can attack Imam Al-Hasan without attacking Imam Al-Hussein during his own imamah as well. And you see the attacks are usually only directed at Imam Al-Hasan alayhi salam. And then we have a narration from Imam Al-Baqarah alayhi salam in which he says the peace treaty, he was asked by the peace treaty, about the peace treaty of Imam Al-Hasan, he says the peace treaty of Imam Al-Hasan is better for the Muslims than everything upon which the moon and the sun have ever risen. So basically he's saying if the whole world were to be, if you want to take it literally, the whole world would be taken and divided into parts and given to the Muslims as their own personal property, this peace treaty is more beneficial to them and did more good to them than doing that to every single Muslim in the world. Okay? Keep that in mind. And then I wanted to end with this narration from Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. There are many of them. I chose this one because I think it gives us, it's a good wrap-up and inshallah a good ending and conclusion to this lecture, and perhaps addressing points that we did not, unfortunately, have time to talk about. So this is my quick translation. The hadith is actually in Bihar al-Anwar, volume 44. It's the second hadith that talks about the biography of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. The Imam is asked, one of the people comes to Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam after the peace treaty. And as we know, many people came and objected to the Imam. They misunderstood and disagreed with the Imam. And so this is one of the answers given by the Imam himself to one of his followers. He comes to him and he tells him, why did you go ahead and accept a peace agreement and treaty with someone like Muawiyah? The Imam tells him, am I not the authority of God over his creatures and his appointed Imam over them? The narrator said, yes, you are. The Imam says, am I not the one about whom the Messenger of God said, Hassan and Hussein are Imams, whether they rise or they sit? The narrator said, yes. He said, so I am therefore an Imam if I chose to rise, and I am equally an Imam if I chose to sit back. So know that if I have signed a treaty with Muawiyah, it is for the same reasons that the Prophet signed peace treaties with Bani Dhumrah, Bani al-Ashja', and the people of Mecca at Hudaybiyah. And those who were disbelievers and those people, so we don't have time to go into the situation, the whole context around why the Holy Prophet signed a peace treaty with the mushrikeen, the kuffar of Quraysh, when he came with all the Muslims to enter Mecca to perform the pilgrimage, and the mushrikeen of Mecca prevented them from entering, and the Holy Prophet, instead of fighting them, he decided to sign a peace treaty with them, that they would go back to Medina and they would only come back the next year and perform the Hajj. The Holy Prophet accepted to do that peace treaty at that time. Why? Why did he not fight them when he was clearly strong enough to fight them? The Imam here says, and so I leave this with you, based on everything that we have said. And inshallah this becomes clearer. The Quran says when the Holy Prophet comes back and performs the pilgrimage, he says, إِنَّا فَتَحْنَا لَكَ فَتْحًا مُبِينًا. We have given you a great victory. We have to see the treaty of Imam Al Hasan as having been a great victory. Whatever context was in place for Sulh al-Hudaybiyah applies to the context, applies to the situation of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam. And if there were benefits there, it means there were benefits here. And it's up to us to study history to make them come to the fore. So he says, Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam says, and the same reasons that the Holy Prophet signed peace treaties, including with the people of Mecca at Hudaybiyah, and those were disbelievers in the revelation itself. They were kuffar. They rejected the prophethood of the Prophet, and the Prophet made a peace deal with them. Whereas Muawiyah and his companions are disbelievers in the interpretation of the revelation, and not the revelation. If I am accepted as an Imam from God, the Imam says, then my decisions must not be ridiculed, whether they are to go into battle or to reach peace, even if the reasons for my decisions are confusing to you. And then the Imam reminds him of the story of Al-Khidr with Prophet Musa alayhi salam. He tells him sometimes you may not understand the reasons and it frustrates you, and then the Imam adds, and had I not signed the peace treaty, there would not have been any of our followers of our Shia left on the face of the earth except those who would be killed. So basically there is no genuine version of Islam that would ever be left on this planet had the Imam chose to go to war instead of preserving the true version of Islam through the peace treaty that was put in place. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us understand the lives of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam and to extract lessons from their lives that we can apply into our lives. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the pleasure of seeing the grave of Imam Al Hasan alayhi salam erected and built again, and that we may go and visit him in this life, and that we are of those who fall under his intercession in the afterlife. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.